Eddie Garcia gained the title of Bingo King by running several of the city's gaming parlors. He was a successful businessman and politically connected.
Friends call Garcia the Bingo King. He owns this bingo parlor on Callahan and others.
He had many friends, and he had problems. He was not without enemies. Garcia was shot in cold blood in the office of his home healthcare business. Shortly after Garcia was killed, 37-year-old James Legate, who was seen fleeing the scene, was arrested for the murder. Legate is not making this investigation any easier. He's behind bars here, unable to post a $500,000 bond and refusing to talk.
My name is James Walter Legate. In 1999, I was convicted of the murder of Eddie Garcia, which I did not do.
This is Detective David Sapansky, Jr., badge 2275 of the San Antonio Police Department's Evidence Unit in reference to case number 98527-239. The incident took place at 1328 Callahan Road on the 3rd day of September 1998. The video we're going to be looking at is in reference to a murder that took place earlier this evening.
In 1998, I was working for Advantage Auto Finance. I started repossessing cars on the side. But I didn't actually repossess the cars personally. When I find a car, I go and I call to report it in that what I was going to do is repossess it and have Springer Towing come and pick it up. In '98, I was introduced to a woman by the name of Marilyn Maddox. The owner of Rose Sports Car, his name was Ali Kalia. He introduced me to her by asking if I wouldn't mind taking her to go get her registrations of her car done. And I was like, yeah, sure. So when we met, I know it was kind of awkward. She had a stethoscope on her rearview mirror. To break the ice, I asked, so you're in the medical field? She goes, yeah, and I asked around here. She goes, no, I'm in home health over there on Culebra and Callahan.
At that point there, we're looking west, and we're going to be panning to the south, and I'm going to give you a 360-degree view of the outside of the area.
Sometime around August, Ali came up and asked me if I remembered Miss Maddox, and I said yes. He goes, well, she defaulted on her car. Can you go pick it up for me? September of 3rd, I figured, well, you know what? I'll just go by the office. You know, maybe she might be there. So I'd go around, I'd drive around, I see that she ain't there. So what I did is I just kept driving by. Across the street was a stop and go. During that time, I ran into another dealer by the name of Dale Heine. He was coming from the auction because I said, hey, what are you doing? I said, I'm looking for Marilyn Maddox. After I spoke with Dale Heine, I went across the street, and I was there. I ran into a friend of mine named Randy, and he asked if I wanted to have a beer, and I said, yeah, sure, why not? I'm not hiding anything. I'm not doing anything. I'm in there. I'm talking with the waitresses. I'm talking with the bartenders. During this time, I was just waiting for Marilyn Maddox, trying to see, hopefully, if I see her drive up.
What we're looking at right now is the front, 1324 Callahan Road. That's the front door to the bar, the Players Bar. I'm going to be walking inside and standing in the doorway. It's at this time that I'm going to pan left, and the table that we're going to be looking at right there directly in front of us is the table that the actor, the arrested person, was apparently viewed at earlier while he was drinking in this bar.
I had went inside to Dependable Home Healthcare to see if I can actually get information on Miss Maddox. I knew that she was doing home health, and I knew that they didn't actually work out the office, but I kind of figured maybe, you know, I can get some information from them. As I walked in, there was a gentleman on the phone, which I didn't even know who it was, and he told me to wait. During this time, well, I get my briefcase and I'm pulling out my business cards while he's on the phone. And when he hung up, I'm about to shake his hand and hand him the card when all of a sudden he just rears up and just flips his table.
This is apparently where the shooting had taken place. This is a small receptive office area right outside the entryway into the office where the complainant was apparently shot. What appears to have been signs of a struggle. An overturned table, overturned chairs, blood evidence on the chair. I'm going to try and pan and give you an overall view of what the room looked or looks like.
Everything happened so fast. I mean, it's just like one solid motion. Everything happened so fast that the table flipped, I fell, and I seen a person behind me as I fell. And next thing I know, I just ran. I mean, I don't know if it was instincts or what. Next thing I know, I'm getting locked up for Eddie Garcia's murder.
A gun, a shot, a murder. Find Legate shackled and, in his words, scared.
I did not kill him. I did see somebody while I was in there, and that's that drawing I made.
A sketch Legate's attorneys have simply called Mr. X.
I'm just sketching what I think, what I know I saw. I saw somebody there. The guy that I drew, it seemed like either had long hair or he had a do-rag on his head, something that was covering his head. I wish that I could have been more helpful. I wish that I could have seen more. I didn't do this.
But police sources tell me, sketch or not, they believe they've got their man. They also tell me they can't rule out the fact that James Legate may have been a hired hitman.
Conviction is a multi-part documentary series that takes a look at the 1998 murder of Eddie Garcia and the subsequent conviction the following year of James Legate. Unlike traditional documentaries, this one is an investigation, and so it does more than just retell the story. We actually investigate a lot of the people, a lot of the players that were a big part of this case.
I think it answers a lot of questions that maybe people even associated with the case didn't realize were still hanging out there. Most importantly, whether all the people that were involved in this murder, involved in this plot, have been brought to justice. I think we do a pretty good job of answering that question.
So how did the idea for Conviction come to be?
We've been working on this for about a year, and initially James Legate began writing me a series of letters early of 2018, kind of retelling his side of the story. Now, I wasn't around in 1998 when this murder happened, but 20 years ago, this was a big deal. This was headline news. KSAT covered it extensively back when it happened.
Garcia owns this entire strip mall.
Paul Venom on KSAT 12 News.
I personally found it really fascinating. There was a lot that just hadn't been looked at ever, and so I thought that would be an interesting project to kind of look at the case, give it a closer look, and then retell that to the public.
I think you could find other murder cases, even high-profile ones, and that happened decades ago, 15 years ago, look back at them, and I think in most of those cases, you would be okay with how it was handled. Was it thoroughly investigated? Was the right person brought to trial? Did they look at all the evidence that was available? I think with the Garcia murder, very early on, you're going to see that this was not investigated as thoroughly as it could have been.
So tell me about James Legate and when you went to go visit him in prison. How many times did you go visit him? What were some of those encounters like?
There was a total of 3 visits. I didn't really have a preconceived notion going in of who I thought he would be and what I thought he would be like. I just wanted to keep an open mind. I got the sense that he was being honest with me in our first encounter. Our first interview was more so I could understand some of the details of the story and then kind of get a read of him. And so going to a prison in and of itself can sometimes be an intimidating task, but I think I felt at ease speaking to him, and I felt like he was being honest and real with us.
It's the most at ease I've ever felt in a prison environment. He's very strong in his words. He believes what he's saying. I think conviction sort of applies to his thoughts on what happened to him and how he feels all these years later. He has conviction in his heart that he was wrongly prosecuted and that the full story is not out there, and I think that comes across when you talk to him.
My name is William Davidson, and I was one of the defense attorneys in the James Legate murder trial. My co-counsel was Bill Burchelman, and Bill Burchelman is deceased. Unfortunately, he died of cancer. I do not believe James Legate got a fair trial. I believe James Legate would not have been found guilty had all the evidence been presented to the jury.
My name is Juanita Vasquez-Gardner. I was one of the prosecutors in the case against James Legate.
My name is Joey Contreras, and I assisted Mr. Vasquez-Gardner in prosecuting this case. I remember being eager to sit on this case because it was a very interesting case. You don't have many murder cases, where the person who's murdered is prominent. It was seen more rather than a murder, as an assassination of a prominent businessman, and that just doesn't happen all the time.
We, as prosecutors, we have to concentrate on the evidence, on what's there in front of us, and not on speculation, and that's what we did, and that's what resulted in Mr. Legate's conviction.
I'm Sergeant Ken Albrecht.
In 1998, I was assigned to the homicide unit and was the lead homicide investigator in the Eddie Garcia murder. It was a very interesting case to work as a detective. The challenge at the time was removing James Legate's claim to be a witness and connecting to the crime in his true role as the shooter. And we were able to do that very effectively. There are whodunits and difficult cases, and Juanita and I have worked plenty of those. This is not one of them. This is one of the easiest murders I've probably worked on, and I've worked on a bunch of them. The evidence was overwhelming. It was a pretty strong case.
James Legate at the time was a person who repossessed cars. James Legate was in the area of the Players Bar in Eddie Garcia's office because he was trying to repossess a car belonging to Marilyn Maddox. He knew Marilyn Maddox had worked for a home health care agency, but he didn't know whose home health care agency. That day he had gone to Players, and while he was in the bar, he started thinking about the home health care, which was next door. And he started thinking about going over there to inquire about whether Marilyn Maddox had ever worked there.
James Legate in 1998 was a small lot car salesman. Several hours before the shooting, there was a bar next door to Mr. Garcia's office that was open during the day, and James Legate was observed by several witnesses being in that bar for several hours, sitting by the window, looking out one of the windows out towards the front porch area, where he would have had the opportunity to see the comings and goings of the bar and the office next door. Well, he arrived at Players, and he stood out because he was there before people normally go to bars and start drinking. He got there early, and he drank for hours. He made quite an impression as the sole patron of this bar on the barmaid. She remembered him distinctly, and the way he would keep getting up to look out the window and acting in a nervous fashion.
During this time, he has a white shirt on. He spills some red taco sauce on the white shirt and wipes it off. Witnesses see this, so they know he has a white shirt on. After being at the bar for several hours, he gets up and he leaves. He went over to Eddie Garcia's office. He says that a man waved him in. Now, he didn't know the man was Eddie Garcia. James says he shook hands with Eddie Garcia. They began to talk, and right away, Eddie Garcia grabbed the table and pulled it up real fast. People in the bar report hearing gunshots. Shots rang out. James says he caught a glimpse of somebody else, which he sketched, and he just got scared and he ran. Several witnesses see Mr. Legate fleeing from the office next door. He's seen fleeing on foot.
Mr. Legate is seen running from the crime scene. He all but shouted out, I'm here, watch me. Everyone get a good look at me. And he drew so much attention to himself.
There were numerous witnesses inside Players, and many of them gave different accounts. One account was a man in a dark shirt ran out of Eddie's office and ran around the corner. Another account said a man in a white shirt ran around the corner. People inside the bar, they confirmed that James had a white shirt on.
So I do remember that there were witnesses and that there were some inconsistencies in what the clothing that the person who was running by was wearing. Oftentimes, there are inconsistencies in what witnesses say somebody is wearing. In fact, they can be totally opposite, black and white.
Bottom line was that we had multiple witnesses who positively identified Mr. Legate as the person seen fleeing the shooting.
He tells me he was scared, and of course I think anybody would be scared if they're in an area and somebody's right in there shooting a gun. and you don't know what's going on. I mean, he drops his portfolio, things fall out, and he runs. I think there was a rush to judgment on the part of the police simply because James Legate was there. He did have a record, and he was the easiest person to pin this on. And because a photocopy of his identification was found in the office, not the real driver's license, but a photocopy. Because the photocopy was found, they assumed that James Legate must have killed Eddie Garcia.
So what he had done was, this was our hypothesis, was that he had run and then gotten rid of the briefcase and the weapon. The weapon was tied in some black tape or some tape of sorts, and they had been discarded in the same general area. As I recall, it was a fenced off area, and it was en route to where he had been running.
We've relocated now to an area right down the street at 5627 Culebra. We were advised that an officer had located a briefcase or a satchel, black in color, that apparently had been carried by the actor as he left the location. I'm standing in front of where the satchel and subsequently the weapon was recovered.
The murder weapon was found about a block or two away from the murder scene along Culebra Road, coming towards town from the murder scene. It was found in a small fenced area that was connected with an apartment complex there. It was found with a briefcase, a black nylon briefcase that matched the description of a briefcase that Mr. Legate was known to carry in his normal business opportunities, and also a briefcase that was described by the people that seen him with it in the bar. James Legate was arrested within the hour of the murder. I want to say around the 30-minute mark, but definitely within the hour.
I think the police did excellent work in investigating the case the first 24 hours. But the problem is the investigation abruptly stopped. As soon as James Legate was arrested, the head detective, Kenneth Albrecht, told the jury, told myself, that everything stopped. Nobody investigated anything else. They didn't investigate the picture James Legate drew. They didn't investigate anything else that ever came in that pointed to anybody else. And so in that respect, I would have to say after those 24 hours, it wasn't sloppy police work, it was no police work. Their job was done. Now it was the DA's job to hammer this thing in and make sure it was James Legate that was convicted.
When you were researching this project, tell me something about the research and what it entailed.
A lot of the research was kind of done in phases. The first part was getting acquainted with the case, which entailed just going over and reading volumes of trial transcripts. There was also, obviously making contact with a lot of the folks who were involved in the case, and then physically going to the scene. I still remember the day that we all went out there and how important that was for us to just kind of get some perspective. All of those things kind of helped us get a better understanding prior to even starting the investigation of what we were looking at.
I thought this would have been at the back of the complex, far removed.
This case also had a lot of moving parts, a lot of people in it. Did you ever feel overwhelmed? What were some of the things, the challenges of so much information and just so many people involved in this?
It is a very complicated case, and a lot of the moving parts are outside of the courtroom and were sort of in play, both before the shooting happened and then long after the shooting happened.
You spoke with attorneys on both sides of the case. What are these attorneys doing now?
There were 3 attorneys that participated in this project. William Davidson, a defense attorney for Mr. Legate, and the 2 prosecutors, Joey Contreras and Juanita Vasquez Gardner. William Davidson is still working as a defense attorney here in town. He has his own practice located off of Broadway. Joey Contreras, at the time of filming, was a district court judge. He is now a defense attorney. Yeah. here in town, and Juanita Vasquez Gardner is still working at the district attorney's office.
And she's actually one of the top folks within Joe Gonzalez's administration.
Can you tell us about how you obtained some of the archive footage that was seen in episode 2 and any challenges putting it together with footage from this, this era?
So there were 2 types of old footage that viewers saw in throughout, sprinkled throughout all of the episodes. The first was KSAT archive video. Then viewers also saw the actual crime scene video taken just moments after the shooting of Eddie Garcia. That is something that media rarely gets their hands on, and fortunately we were able to get that initially given to us by the Legate family, and then we subsequently requested a copy.
Was there any challenge putting it together with footage from this era or anything like that?
Yeah, well, if you go back to the scene, it doesn't look incredibly different. The building's been remodeled, but it's still essentially laid out the same way it was back in 1998. That auto zone is still there, that field, that empty field is still there. The little iron rot area where they found the murder weapon, where they found the gun, is still there. It looks different now. Back then it was maroon, today it's black. So that was actually kind of cool for us to be able to compare then and now what the crime scene looked like, what different areas of that intersection, Culebra and Callahan, looked like. So I wouldn't say it was necessarily a challenge, but just something that was unique to this story. A lot of times you'll go to a murder scene and it doesn't even exist anymore. And in this case, it kind of did, kind of didn't. It just looked different.
The evidence was really solid against him. We felt comfortable with it, very comfortable.
The term we use is a laydown, which means it cannot be lost. I described it as a laydown.
Because James Legate was on the scene, he was an easy man to put this on. Based on the evidence, we had a good shot at winning. And that evidence appeared in various forms throughout the trial.
Eddie Garcia was gunned down in his office, known as San Antonio's Bingo King because he owned several halls in the city. Davidson says police have the wrong man. There is no physical evidence to link Legate to the murder except he was in the building and he ran. He didn't have gunpowder residue on his hands, no fingerprints were found, there is no motive.
When we had the detective on the stand, Detective Albrecht, I asked him about forensics. Specifically, was there blood on James Legate's clothes? And he said, no, there was not. I then asked him about gunpowder residue, and he said there was no gunpowder residue. James Legate tested within hours clean. Nothing on his hands, nothing on his clothes. I asked him about fingerprints. He said there was no fingerprints. I said, so in general, there's no forensics connecting my client to this case. Is that correct? He said, that's correct.
Well, I think it was the evidence that was found at the scene pointed us immediately to him.
You don't have many murderers who leave their identification and personal belongings and car at the crime scene and are seen by multiple witnesses drinking just yards from the murder scene and are seen running from the murder right after the shots are fired. You don't see that ever.
We also found things in his vehicle that we believed tied him to the offense.
Some documents that were seized from Legate's car, and they showed that day after day, he went to the crime scene and watched Eddie Garcia come and go, come and go, come and go, which other cars pulled into the parking lot. There's no other explanation for those documents and the surveillance that Legate was doing, except that he was looking for the right time to murder Eddie Garcia, and he found it.
I examined the documents that were found in James Legate's car. The prosecutor's position was that these detailed the comings and goings of Eddie Garcia leading up to the murder. They didn't. Most of the documents were a song called Gypsy Man. My soul is lost, the days are black. That's a song. He also had license plate numbers, but that was his job. He took down license plate numbers for cars he was going to repossess.
We didn't find any supporting information that he was there to repossess a car. What we do know is that Mr. Legate wasn't just by chance at that place. He knew several of Mr. Garcia's business partners, and he's connected to the murder weapon.
The chief witness for the prosecution was a man who had lied to police and given them several different versions of what happened. His name was Jessy/John Hernandez. He was a drug dealer.
Jessy Hernandez was an individual that we were able to connect to this crime through the gun traces.
The gun was traced to him by the ATF. He'd gotten a gun off a guy for a cocaine deal.
I always knew him as John. That's how I knew him, John. He says, hey, my name's John Hernandez. Okay, how you doing? He had, and then when they told me, do you know what Jessy Hernandez is? I said, I don't know what Jessy Hernandez is. I didn't know who they were talking about. Then he introduced me to a guy named Pedro Zamora. Supposed to be an owner of a club called Mexico Que Nice. At that time, Pedro Zamora wanted me to find a cheap car for a friend of his, and he invited me, he goes, whenever you want, come to my club, you know. So I visited once.
What we do know is that Mr. Zamora was a business partner with Mr. Garcia, and that they owned and they were involved in this Mexico Que Nice bar together.
Pedro Zamora was mismanaging the club and letting people in that without having to pay a cover charge and giving them free drinks and losing money. And Mr. Garcia was going to force Mr. Zamora out.
Mr. Garcia's demise began when he had a falling out with a business partner. And the business partner didn't take it lightly and hatched a plot with a couple of other people in a bar. And we were able to present evidence of the conversation they had where they planned, the former business partner of Mr. Garcia recruited Mr. Legate to take care of Mr. Garcia because of the falling out they had had. I mean, it all took place in a bar.
Oftentimes in Mexico, people refer to abogado as an official or a person that gets things done or can do paperwork, generate paperwork that's legitimate paperwork. And so I think that what Mr. Zamora had done was tell Mr. Legate at one point in time that he wanted him to do some extra work for him on the side, like bodyguard type, and then that he wanted him to take care of an abogado that had a place next to Players, which is where Mr. Garcia's office was.
I remember a John Hernandez who we talked to. In talking to him, I think he minimized his role in providing the murder weapon, just because it's kind of human nature to minimize your role when your role led to the death of somebody. But eventually, you know, he did testify, and what he said was simple and all we needed. I gave Legate the gun that was used to kill Mr. Garcia. It was that simple.
The testimony of Jessy Hernandez is problematic because he had too much of a motive to lie. The ATF traced the gun directly to him. There was no question he had the gun, no question at all. But what happens is he's got drug charges that are pending, and so the DA cuts him a deal. Jessy Hernandez was facing present drug charges during that trial. Second-degree felony drug charges carrying up to a 20-year sentence. And so Jessy Hernandez was a liar. He was somebody who was a well-known liar. He was facing drug charges that were subsequently dropped directly after his testimony.
Jessy Hernandez, the greatest liar there is, because I've never in my life has done anything that Jessy Hernandez is talking about. For one, he has never given me a gun. Two, all this stuff that he's making up because they traced the gun to him.
It doesn't make sense to me that James Legate would be a hitman for anybody. Hitmans can typically be paid very well. We don't have any proof that James Legate was paid anything. I do not know where Jessy Hernandez was the day of the murder. I know that there was many calls between him and Pedro Zamora the day of the murder, but I don't know where he was.
We do know that Mr. Zamora apparently leaves town within a week of the murder. By the time we started hearing about him and any possible connection, he was gone by then.
I think justice was partially served. I think justice would be more fully served if Pedro Zamora were held accountable in some way. Maybe somewhere along the way he's made some comments to somebody or some admissions. But I don't think Mr. Legate was in on it alone. I do believe that with regard to Mr. Legate, justice was served, but I think there are others that could be held accountable as well.
Was justice completely served? No. The person who hired and set this in motion went free. The gunman didn't, but you take what you get, and that's what we did. As I recall, the sentence was 99 years. I think that about fits the crime. Justice was served.
So in episode 3, viewers get to see some of the evidence presented in the trial. How did you get your hands on that?
We had a great relationship with the previous district clerk, Donna K. McKinney, and it was just a phone call that I made to her. And you know, they literally have a building downtown, a giant archive room, especially in these big cases where they retain a lot of the physical evidence. So it was just a matter of her sending one of her employees over there, grabbing the box, and then arranging for a time to go over there and view it. We were not allowed to touch it. She was the one who handled it, and I think she put on gloves, which was, you know, a truly fascinating experience to be part of. This was us actually physically seeing the clothing that Legate was wearing the day of the shooting.
Yeah, for me it was almost a surreal experience because you rarely get that opportunity. Seeing that shirt, that white shirt that was made such a big deal of, was there blood or was it taco sauce? And getting to see that in person 20 years later, you know, the yellowing of it from being stored away for 20 years, the boots that he was wearing, you know, with the dirt on them, the actual photocopy of the driver's license that was found in Eddie Garcia's office. Getting to see that up close and personal was really just kind of, for me, a surreal experience.
So viewers only saw a photo of the gun. What actually happened to that gun that was used to murder Eddie Garcia?
We had access to physical evidence thanks to the district clerk's office, but they aren't able to hold firearms even if they've been disassembled. So the best we could do is color photos of it.
Its whereabouts are unknown. We'll just kind of, I guess, never know. We don't know if it's destroyed or if it's just being held somewhere, but we were unable to find it for the purposes of this investigation. My name is Isis Romero. I'm a reporter with KSAT 12 News, and we're working on a documentary about the 1998 murder of Eddie Garcia. He was known as the Bingo King, and we're trying to track down the folks who served on the jury. Were you a member of that jury? Do we have that right, Gloria? Do you remember?
My name is Maria Gloria de Aro, and I was a juror in the trial.
How did you feel about being in the jury? Did you want to do it?
Well, yes and no, because I don't know, it feels like I'm killing a person. So, but all the evidence were against him.
I already knew that it was going to be an uphill battle. I had everything denied. Everything was denied. Every objection, everything that my attorney tried to do, it was denied.
A strange twist of events for Judge Sharon McRae.
When I first met James Legate, he told me that the judge was biased against him. And so I asked James Legate, do you want to have a recusal hearing? Do you want me to try to get the judge off the case? Because the problem is that if we do this and we don't get the judge off the case, we might anger the judge. If I could go back today and talk to my former self back then, I would tell him not to do the recusal hearing. I don't know if it would make any difference. I don't know.
It was a very interesting trial. Yes, indeed it was. I don't remember all the details, but it was interesting. My name is Pamela June Johnson Coleman. I was one of the jurors back then.
What were your initial assessments of the defendant, Mr. Legate, when trial started?
I didn't have any opinion at all, really. I just wanted to watch him as the evidence was laid out.
There were people the jurors did not hear from. We didn't hear from Marilyn Maddox because we couldn't find her. They did not hear from James's friend who was at the gas station as to why James was in the area. I didn't know the judge would not allow us to present that to the jury. And there's no reason to suppress that evidence. They did not hear from Charles Rodriguez, a man who came forward who had all kinds of information he was going to tell the jury about who did the hit and why it happened, how much was paid, who was going to corroborate this with other facts about the case. And what should have happened is this person should have been allowed to testify to the jury, but that was all shut down. And so the jury heard a small portion of what was there. And so what bothers me so much about this case is that the standard of beyond a reasonable doubt was fairly easy to reach because we could not present the evidence we needed to present.
Quentin Long.
This is the home of Quentin Long.
Okay. My name is Isis Romero. I'm with KSAT 12. We are the ABC affiliate here in town.
My name is Quentin Long, and I was the foreman of the jury. It is a very sobering experience, especially in a case where somebody's put away for a while. I remember we sat around a big table and we just went around and people talked. We sent them around in an order, and if they didn't want to talk then, but everybody had their say on what they felt was the compelling reason that they thought he was guilty. Either the verdict's going to be not guilty, hung jury, or guilty. And everybody came to the guilty.
Years later, James Legate wanted to do a writ, which is an examination of problems that may have happened that are outside the trial transcript. He hired me and another investigator to go look at the old DA records. We were shown into a room where there were 10 boxes of records and found a memo from an investigator who had gone out and interviewed a Marilyn Maddox. Right away, Marilyn Maddox, when she was told about James Legate, said he didn't do it. And that's exculpatory information. That's something the jury needed to hear. But instead of us being told about this, the prosecution sat on it. In fact, the investigator told her to stop talking. It's in the memo. So that memo was very crucial. It should have been turned over to the defense. And had all this information been presented to the jury, and the jury came back with a guilty verdict, I'd have no problem with the case. But when you have so much evidence suppressed, so much evidence hidden, and a man goes to prison for 99 years, it's just not right.
I can only think that Mr. Hildebrand, the investigator, didn't pursue it because he thought that that it would be better if the attorneys talked to her instead of him. As I recall, when I called Miss Maddox to talk to her and tell her about the conversation that Mr. Hildebrand said that he had with her, she was indignant that somebody had said that she said that he didn't do it. It made things very difficult.
Do you remember how long it took the jury to reach a verdict?
Oh, I mean, they argued and argued.
There might have been some hesitation, if I remember correctly. One or two people say, well, I don't know. There were probably some people that had some unsureness going into it, but they eventually came around and said, yeah, I think he was guilty.
Were there some jurors who wanted to vote not guilty?
One.
Do you remember who that was?
No.
Was it a man or a woman? Do you remember?
I think it was a woman, but no, just one person. All the other ones both did guilty.
Do you remember, did they kind of take a vote or a tally at first and then she didn't want to vote guilty, or how? What was that like, if you can remember?
All I know is she said that she was fearful. She was scared. And I'm like, why did you get up in here if you were, or why? Or all of a sudden it was just like, I don't understand. What does it have to do with you? Until after, then she had something to do with it. I don't know how she said she knew him or how to, I can't remember, was that same day or the next day we came back and to find out that she did know him.
We tracked down all the jurors and we understand that there was a connection between one of the jurors and Mr. Legate's family. At the time, were you aware of a juror who had a connection to the Legate family?
I was not aware of that, but that's another problem with the case.
We've uncovered some stuff with some jury issues with the panel that was seated for your trial. Mary Barcenas, to what extent were you aware of the connection between Mary and your family, specifically Peggy?
Well, you know, I didn't know anything about any of the jurors in my trial. I didn't know that they knew any of my family. I didn't even know their names. I didn't know nothing about them. The only thing I learned about each juror was what they testified during the voir dire. And I did not learn about Mary Barcenas until my nephew brought it to my attention. Now, I didn't know that she knew my sister. I didn't learn this until last year sometime, I think it was.
A juror who has a personal opinion and personal knowledge about a defendant that could affect deliberation should not serve. So that could be an issue. However, in spite of that, that doesn't change any of the overwhelming facts that all point to James Legate as a murderer.
How were you able to find these jurors 20 years later?
Part of the trial transcript was their voir dire process, where they go one by one and they interview each juror. So we had a little bit of information that was given at voir dire about each juror, in addition to just their name. Some of them told where they worked, and anytime you do a background check, some of that will pop up. So we were able to match the juror with those particular background checks and get their latest addresses, and in some cases their latest phone numbers. So from there, Eddie and I spent maybe 2 to 3 days going house to house and looking for each juror. Out of the 12 jurors, only one has moved out of the area. That person now lives in Florida. So the remaining 11 are still in this area. There was a couple that we were just unsuccessful in getting their whereabouts.
Did most of the jurors seem receptive to talk to you about this case, or how did they feel when you approached them?
For the most part, most of the jurors were surprised we were there. Here we are 20 years later, a door knock at their door, and it was just not at all what they were expecting to hear that day when they opened the door. There were a few that just kind of wanted their privacy, another handful that just said that they don't remember. They'd love to help and give us as much context and understanding as they could. They just didn't remember a lot of the details and therefore didn't feel comfortable speaking about it 20 years later.
So how did you find out that Mary Barcenas was connected to the Legate family?
So we had heard from a member of the Legate family that the family was acquainted with the Barcenas family at the time of trial, and that there had been an incident years after trial involving the juror's son. And so that's when Dylan went and pulled some of the records for Victor, who is the son of Mary Barcenas, and we found what we found.
And that was really like a light bulb moment when I think it was a lot of stuff in this story happened on Friday. Like
I think it was Saturday. You text me on
Saturday. Yeah, we'd get it like late Friday or into the weekend, and then we'd have some downtime and be able to look through stuff. But just went through, I got the entire case file from the burglary, the story that we'd gotten a tip on, and went through it, and then sure enough, I started seeing the name, and it just, boom, light bulb went off, and this is a big connection that I don't think anybody on the prosecution or police side had made until that very moment.
Yeah, and these were more than just acquaintances. Victor Barcenas, the juror's son, was very much involved in the lives of Peggy Legate's children at the time of trial. And so these weren't just, somebody that you just kind of knew who they were. These were two families that at the time of trial were very much involved in each other's lives. And then post-trial, it's unclear whether they had a falling out or what happened, but at least according to the police report, Victor Barcenas said that he did not care for the homeowner's son, this being Peggy Legate's son and James Legate's nephew.
There's a reason when they panel a jury, you have dozens of people that get whittled down to 12 people. And yeah, you have to ask a lot of questions in this case. Of all those people that were brought into the courtroom that day, why was she part of the final 12?
Sí, dale. Ya está. Correcto.
Pedro Zamora could not be found in 1998, but here we are 20 years later, and we know that that is no longer the case. I don't know if you remember writing this affidavit, but in here, you wrote it back in 2004. You mentioned that according to a confidential underworld informant, Mr. Zamora had been stabbed and killed in Mexico. So we didn't know whether or not that was true. Obviously we needed to confirm that. So we started our search looking for some family members to see, could you confirm that, he had been killed, or can you give us a photo of him? One of the ways we tried to do that was by going to Facebook. We began researching some of Mr. Zamora's family members. We began with his sister, Rosaura. She's mentioned multiple times in the police paperwork. And so we began with her and her profile. She has a number of profiles on Facebook. And from her profile, we were able to find more members of Mr. Zamora's family, and ultimately Mr. Zamora's page, indicating to us that he is indeed alive. A lot of these photos are fairly recent. We had no idea what he looked like when this process started, but I want to share these Facebook photos with you of Mr. Zamora. This is Mr. Zamora. This is his son, Johnny, right here. That's Mr. Zamora. And this is Carolina Velasquez. She's the woman that he ran off to Mexico with back in 1998.
Yeah, that's him.
I don't know if you've ever seen a photo of Mr. Zamora, have you?
I don't recall seeing a photo of Mr. Zamora. This is very interesting because nobody could find them back then.
Yeah, and of course, Facebook wasn't around in 1998,
no,
and that's been a tremendous resource to us 20 years later. So now the question, how do we find him? Just by kind of going over his profile, you can tell he lives in Mexico, but where in Mexico? If you remember, at the time of the murder, Mr. Zamora left a mysterious note to his wife, Anita. And the note doesn't say much. It essentially says that he leaves his business dealings to Anita and his sister, Rosaura, and says he leaves town. Didn't give us a whole lot of information about his whereabouts. Anita did not disclose a whole lot of information to police as well. So we requested the petition for divorce filed by Anita here in Bexar County, and we were hoping that in this document somewhere we would find something that would ultimately lead us to him. On the second page you can see we found an address for Mr. Zamora. It told us at the very least that at the time of this petition for divorce being filed, he was living in Querétaro, Mexico. We hired a crew of freelance journalists that live in Mexico City to travel to Querétaro and try and locate him. Our crew spent the day in Querétaro, Mexico, exploring the city, exploring his neighborhood. At some point in the day, Mr. Zamora sees our crew and approaches our crew and asks them what they're doing in his neighborhood. He was very suspicious of them. At this point, they have a brief exchange. Mr. Zamora orders them into his home where he shuts off their camera.
Hay un grupo de periodistas allá. Ay,
¿Te deja tu cámara ahí? ¿Sí? ¿Está bien? Déjame la apago.
What happened yesterday outside of and then inside of Pedro's house?
Pedro Zamora started questioning about what kind of investigation are you doing and why are you here? I have nothing to do with Eddie Garcia's murder. I was at the funeral, he said. I have nothing to do with it. The only thing I can tell you about Eddie Garcia is that he was a very good person with me. We were friends, not partners. The bar Mexico Tonight was mine. It was not owned by Eddie Garcia. We were only friends. He was just helping me with the finances because I didn't speak English. That is why I'm very thankful with Eddie Garcia.
He did also mention that he was kidnapped many years ago and he was able to escape the kidnapping, and so he's just very much on edge, and that's why he spotted them and just was a little bit uneasy that they were there.
And that would make sense. That would make sense with what I wrote, because that's what I heard that he had been killed, but I didn't know he escaped before that.
Due to the circumstances of that day, we were unable to get any further information from Mr. Zamora about his relationship with Mr. Legate and his alleged involvement in this crime. So I'm going to open this up to you now to give comments on the discovery that Mr. Zamora is alive and claims to not have any involvement in the Eddie Garcia murder.
There's something awful to be said for living looking over your shoulder the whole time, which is how he's living. So that's got to be an awful way to live. That's number one. Number two, I'm not surprised at all that he's alive. I think he's a resourceful fellow, and he knows what he needs to do to, to stay alive, and obviously he's done that.
Does the fact that he's alive and apparently healthy, will there be an attempt to question him? Is he clear of ever facing charges in this? How does that work?
Well, there's some legal, probably insurmountable problems with bringing a prosecution against Mr. Zamora. Number one is Texas law requires corroboration of the word of someone who was involved in the crime pointing the finger at somebody. Do we have anything more than that person's word? In Texas, you cannot bring a prosecution on the basis of that person's word alone.
With Legate, what we had was him at the scene of the crime, his belongings being found at the scene, him running from the scene, his car being found there. So there was other corroborating evidence, not necessarily direct, but definitely circumstantial that could tie him to it. We don't have those kinds of circumstances with Mr. Zamora.
Now, one of the things that the prosecutors told us was we didn't have a case against Zamora. We had all of these things against Legate. We could, win a conviction. We don't have all of those things present for Mr. Zamora. Does that matter? I mean, are you necessarily trying to get a conviction, or are you just trying to get information?
Well, that's part of the problem with the adversarial system. When I went many years later into the DA's files, because James Legate was going to do a writ of habeas corpus, I was allowed to see for the first time 10 boxes of files. And that's where I found the DA had hidden this witness from us. But what was interesting was in these files was nothing about the business dealings of Eddie Garcia. Nothing. You would have thought they would have investigated people who had accused Eddie or had been out for Eddie, but there was nothing. Mr. Zamora was supposedly one of the key to these cases. The DA and the SAPD had really pumped him up and said that he was the person who had paid Legate. They weren't sure how he paid him. They weren't sure how much he paid him, but somehow he paid James Legate to do this killing. But nobody could prove it, and nobody knew where he was. One of the detectives said he was going to follow Mr. Zamora into Mexico. Obviously that never happened. Of course, now that you found him, if they're serious, of course, maybe they'll go down there and pick him up, but I sort of doubt it.
So this was Juan, John, Jesse. He goes by many first names, but first, is that the man who testified that he supplied the gun used during the murder?
Because it was 20 years ago, I can't confirm that. I can't validate that.
We do know that, based off of SID numbers, dates of birth, that this person was the same person who was accused of possessing cocaine right around the time of Garcia's murder, and then was indicted in that same case in December of '98, and then was later given immunity to testify at trial. When Hernandez was questioned by Albrecht and SAPD in connection to this case, he listed an address in Dubuque.
Correct.
And said that his date of birth, if you'll notice, was in February of 1969.
Correct.
Okay, so that would have put him at almost 31 years old by the time it went to trial.
That's correct.
In '99. Okay. In our research for this story, we were able to locate a person named Jessy Hernandez with that date of birth, living in Centralia, Illinois, which is just east of St. Louis, inside the Illinois border, probably a 45, 50-minute drive from St. Louis. With that date of birth, showing that he had a history of living in this part of Texas prior to moving to Illinois. We hired a private investigator based in St. Louis that does a lot of work in Illinois to see what his firm could find. They found a lot of the same information that we did, everything from utility records to a somewhat minor criminal history there, and the fact that the same Hernandez they found had lived in Texas. We were able to also find him on Facebook, and the Jessy Hernandez living in Centralia, Illinois, is seen there, and the mole under his eye is what stood out to us, that possibly we may have an issue between this gentleman and then this man right here. I went over the testimony the night before we flew to St. Louis, just to kind of have all my ducks in a row. It's something I like to do, especially if we're going to do an unplanned interview, which is what we ended up doing with this man. This was with Hernandez on the stand, under cross-examination from Vasquez Gardner. Please tell the jury your full name. Juan Antonio Hernandez. Do you also go by John or Jesse? Yes. How old are you? 26. So that right there, you have someone on the witness stand who is approximately 4 years younger than the person that was interviewed by SAPD when this case was in the early stages to begin with. So that really stood out to us, and that was something that I kept in mind when we got on the plane and then later went to St. Louis and then drove into Illinois. Private investigators picked us up at the hotel, drove us into Illinois. They had staked out his house a couple days prior to our visit, and then sure enough, as they predicted, early in the evening, right as the sun was setting, he came home from work for the day. Jesse, how you doing? I'm Dylan Collier. Came a long way to talk to you from San Antonio. Hear about the Eddie Garcia murder. Just had a couple questions for you. James Legate, Pedro Zamora, Eddie Garcia.
I don't know what you're talking about. Really, honestly, I mean, I don't know.
Our records have you as this guy right here. Date of birth on there.
That's my birthday.
2/13 and 69.
Yeah, that's my birthday.
Okay.
Is somebody using my ID?
You never lived 13,300 block of Dubuque?
No, I never lived in San Antonio. No.
The Facebook photos, while we put them together on Jessy Hernandez, showed a guy with a mole under his eye. This guy had that mole under his eye, but in the original mugshot from the indictment on the cocaine charges, you had a person who, as you mentioned, had a scar in the eyebrow, no mole under his eye. Jessy Hernandez, Juan Hernandez, clearly not the same person. We began doing more research on people connected to him, potential relatives, people that come up in LexisNexis when you do a search. And we did find a Juan Antonio with a date of birth in 1973. That name was also part of the Legate case file as an alias that Hernandez used at times. And we did find a mugshot from Eureka, which is a small town outside of St. Louis. And this was the mugshot after several weeks of wrangling with them that they finally released. And that appears to be the same man who testified and was part of the Legate case.
So you can't really tell that he has the scar on this older picture, but you can see the cleft in the chin.
Right.
No, it's him.
We believe it's the same man, minus obviously a lot of hair. This was a mugshot from 2014, so you're talking about 16 years later.
Well, that's him.
So did you find any connection between this guy and this guy?
Oh, yeah. These are brothers. We have found that these are Jessy and Juan Antonio are brothers. They're not the same person. We tracked down a person with intimate knowledge of the Hernandez brothers. And that person told us that Juan Antonio never went by Jessy. He was always Juan or John, but that he was on probation in Gonzales County at the time of the murder. So he stole his brother, his older brother, Jesse's identity, and used it for the purposes of this trial. So he lied to you, he lied to police, he lied about who he initially was.
What we have here is older brother, not associated with the case, younger brother, when questioned by police, using his older brother's information.
Well, that's absolutely amazing because it means that the DA may have presented perjured testimony. You have somebody who's up there identifying themselves as one person when they're really somebody else. Had the jury known there was a known liar on the stand testifying about his birthday and so forth that was all a lie, he might also be lying about giving the gun to my client. So that's the implication at the time of trial. At the time now, if James Legate can show that this man was up there lying and perjuring himself and he was put there by the prosecutors knowingly or unknowingly, he may very well be able to get a new trial. This is amazing revelation. This is amazing revelation right here.
This is an official SAPD statement document that has the wrong person listed.
And this was presented to us as the defense as this is the witness. They presented false paperwork to us, somebody else. It wasn't really the person who was going to testify. In addition to all the wrong people who we didn't hear from, people that should have testified that weren't allowed to testify, we have the state putting on somebody who's possibly perjured themselves and is either known by the state to do that or unknown by the state to do that. But it's a big deal.
If the defense had caught what we caught and keyed on this, what impact do you think it would have had immediately and then long term on that trial? If you had brought him up onto the stand and then on cross-examination, if Davidson or Bertelman had said, we think you lied about who you were when you were questioned about this murder a year ago, what do you think would have happened?
I think it's hard to speculate, but I think that it also just depends on the strength of the evidence that they would have presented weighed against the strength of the evidence that was presented against Legate, along with Legate's own testimony. And so it's hard to go back and know what a jury would have done or if they would have given it any weight.
Whose responsibility was it to get it right? Was that SAPD? Was it the DA's office? Whose responsibility was it to catch this discrepancy and really figure out who he was, either through fingerprints or some other method to confirm that this is indeed him.
Well, the person who took this statement should have confirmed that the information he gave was correct. Usually it's done by presenting an identification. Now, if he presented his brother's identification, you know, and he bared any kind of a resemblance to his brother, it's not that hard to get away with it.
It does bear on his credibility, because if you're going to lie and use your own brother's identity, that's something I think that the jury would have been entitled to know.
Somebody who lies about their identity would probably lie about anything.
Is this something that where the jury should have known, and the court now should enter this into evidence, or what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I think it's Legate was on trial. The focus was whether or not Legate was the shooter. You know, whether this guy assumed the identity of Elvis Presley does not change the overwhelming evidence that was piled up against Legate. It just shows that he is a liar. That's the way I see it.
But at the same time, he was your star witness. He was the guy who said, I gave Legate the gun. And if he's the type of guy who would not only lie about his identity, but then throw his own brother under the bus, how can the jury believe any word out of his mouth? We're looking for your brother, Juan Antonio.
I don't know.
You don't know where he is?
I can't say nothing. What do you need looking for?
Well, we had gone to visit Jessy in Centralia, Illinois, and he told us that he's back here in Nixon.
Not that I know.
He's not back in town?
Not that I know.
Do you know why Juan used Jesse's name when he was questioned in this murder case back in 90? He's got your information on there.
I know, but I don't know.
Do you have any way for us to contact him? You don't know where he is at all?
Episode 5 was the bombshell, right? It's the revelation where Pedro Zamora, you find out he's alive. Can you tell us in detail how you found him and just a little bit about that?
I knew that Facebook, if there was ever a place to find a piece of information, Facebook would be our best bet. For me, the curiosity was really driven by wanting to see what he looked like. I hadn't seen a picture of him. I didn't know what he looked like. I just kind of wanted to see this person who we've learned so much about in the course of this case. And so I started looking at his family members and just kind of cross-referencing, you know, this person may be a potential relative and this one may be a potential nephew. And then finally it just kind of all came together. I'll never forget that moment sitting at my desk when I saw this photo pop up on Facebook from Johnny Zamora, who is Mr. Zamora's son. And it was a Father's Day photo posted on Father's Day a few years ago, and it says in Spanish, you know, Happy Father's Day, Dad. And underneath it, someone comments with Pedro's name. And for me, that was the giveaway. Wait, this is someone who potentially was a son, and now we have a photo where someone is calling him Pedro. Even though their profiles weren't connected, the fact that he had liked that photo eventually led us to Pedro and the revelation that he was still alive. People are really easy to track down if you have their date of birth. In this case, we didn't have a date of birth. And so how do we find his address if we don't have a date of birth? And I just remember those meetings where we were kind of going back and forth, can we pull a birth record? No, we can't pull those. You know, Social Security. There were so many different things and options that we looked at before Dylan said, you know, maybe there's a divorce document somewhere in there that'll kind of.
Because he fled. He fled shortly after the murder and was still married to this woman, but you had to think, well, at some point she needs to move on with her life, and a part of doing that would be to file for divorce, which in this case, you know, luckily there was a record for it.
And then we had an address.
What were some of the challenges with working with a crew in Mexico, and also some of the advantages of that?
they know the lay of the land. Working with a set of journalists and a team of journalists that just kind of knew how things rolled down there was definitely an advantage. On the flip side of that, Dylan is kind of known for his ambush-style interviews and just kind of not backing down and getting answers, and his assertiveness. And you know, you kind of have to give that to someone else and just hope that they come back with some of the answers.
And I don't think that approach would work. I don't think I'd last long in Mexico doing the approach that I do here in the U.S., which, you know, says a lot about our First Amendment and how TV works in this country, and I'm thankful for that, but that doesn't always translate in other countries. I think Mexico is one of those places where it wouldn't work out as well.
Dylan, what was going through your mind when you interviewed Jessy Hernandez?
So I had a bunch of scenarios playing in my head of how this will go, including him claiming to have no knowledge of what I was talking about whatsoever. So, you know, I walked up. We had a private investigator track him down and do some undercover work in the days before our trip. So I just walked up, and he decided to answer a certain way, and I just went down the path of questions that I had put out, you know, in my head, if he was going to answer that way. So it went from there. And actually, I can't believe he talked to us for as long as he did, and probably would have continued to talk to us and reveal a little bit about his relationship with his brother, except for the fact that his wife and then daughter came outside and they were not happy about us being there. They're the ones that sort of ended the interview.
So did you go to any other locations in St. Louis and San Antonio, other than where it was, you know, in the documentary?
Looking for the real Juan Hernandez?
We went to every address in and around St. Louis that came back to him. I think he's held a bunch of jobs. I think he's lived a few places. This is Juan that we're talking about. And it was one of those things, every time we'd go, they thought the name was a little bit familiar, but he hadn't lived there in a while, so we just left a business card and moved on to the next place. And then, of course, the trip to Nixon.
Yeah, that was the final place that we went. When you pull up his latest background check, an address for Nixon does show up, which is his hometown. And so we went out to that address. It was an empty trailer. We went to his sister's home, and you know, as you'll see at the end of episode 5, just wasn't very cooperative in giving us any more information about her brother's whereabouts.
No matter what, we're supposed to get justice. Nobody deserves to die the way my father died. Nobody does. But at the same time, we deserve the truth. And my father deserves to be able to rest in peace. I know my father wouldn't want us to be hurting like this, but the thing is, we are. My name is Lisa Garcia, and I am the oldest daughter of Eddie Garcia.
Do you believe James Legate was the one who pulled the trigger?
I can't answer that. I mean, I guess yes, because yes, he was found guilty of it, but until you can show me different and show me proof that you did not pull that trigger, then and only then. But there's nothing to show me that you didn't pull the trigger. Show me different if you think you didn't do it. We have a new DA, but even as a new DA, you still have to follow through on what's currently happening.
Do you want the DA to look at this? Do you want the DA
We
to...
we want the truth. We want the truth, or I should say, I want the truth. I want the truth of this and seeing, you know what, wherever it may fall, holding everybody accountable for their actions. And I'll repeat it again. Do I think James Legate is innocent? No. Did he have a part? Yeah. But are there probably more? Yes. But that's up for SAPD to do their job, as well as the DA's office.
Are you satisfied with the job they did?
With SAPD?
And the DA's office?
No, never was. I mean, it has taken a toll on us. I mean, we miss our father. I have hope that we will be able to find the truth out of this, whatever it may be.
I don't know what to think anymore. I'm confused. I mean, I have so many things running through my mind. I know in your letter you said you're not here to prove my innocence or my guilt, and I understand that and I respect that you're trying to find the truth, the facts. And you have uncovered the truth and the facts. One, Zamora's still alive. Two, Hernandez ain't the person he proclaimed to be during my trial, so everything he said was a lie. His credibility is now in question. People are going to believe what they want to believe. No matter how much you can tell them, hey, the light's red, they're going to say, no, I'm going to argue with you, it's green. I'm just hoping if anything, they can see that the justice system ain't what it's all out to be. No matter what I try or anybody else tries to say or the evidence that gets put before them, they're probably going to still have this belief system in them just to, you know, the system's not wrong, the system's not wrong, it can't be wrong, you know, but, you know, the truth is, it is wrong. It has flaws, and it needs to be corrected. At the beginning, I was very angry. I was mad. I was mad at the system. I was mad at everybody. But I had to learn to forgive. I had to learn to accept things the way they are. And keeping that in mind, it like brought me into a spiritual sense more than I've ever been in my life. You know, because I started believing more, and my faith grew, and I thank God every day, every day. There's not a moment that I don't wake up or I walk during the day that I don't just say, hey, thank you, thank you. I believe I should get a new trial. Will they give it to me? God only knows. Do I hope on one? Yes, I do. I just want what is fair, what is right. I'm not asking for anything else. I just want to have a chance at life, whatever life I got left. I want a chance to prove my innocence. How much more time do I got to spend in here? Probably the rest of my life. But like I said, I got faith. I got faith. I believe that God has a certain plan and He works in ways that nobody will ever understand. So I just wait and accept what comes.
Mr. Legate has always maintained that there was more to this case than what was presented at the trial. Do you agree?
Oh, absolutely. One of the sound bites that the prosecutors gave us was that this was an open and shut case, that this was one of the easiest murder cases that they've ever tried. And there was a lot more to this. Just the fact that Zamora is out there in existence when they all but gave up in ever finding him. And one of the things that the prosecutor said was, well, we couldn't bring a case against him, and I'm paraphrasing here. But the pursuit of justice to me means more than just, are you able to get a case against him, but are you able to question him and even determine whether or not he had anything to do with it. And so, there were a lot of lingering questions that I think we helped to answer in this process. So yes, I agree that there was much more to this story.
Did you contact additional people who weren't in this documentary for any additional sources, just additional information?
I explored a lot of, I don't know if conspiracy theories is the right phrase for it, but went down a lot of rabbit holes that were mentioned either in the trial or in some of the appeal paperwork that came after the conviction of Legate, and spent an extensive amount of time just making sure that those weren't factual leads. So a lot of the behind the scenes work that we did never even made it into the 6 episodes.
What happens next? Will there be more to follow in the case of James Legate?
That's a good question. I think it all depends. I know that we've now revealed our findings to all the parties involved. We've revealed our findings to Mr. Legate. And so it's unknown what happens next. I think there are differing opinions on what avenues are available to Mr. Legate now that we have found what we found and are sharing it with the public. And so that'll be yet to be determined, what happens in this seemingly nonstop saga of the Bingo King murder.